Hello there, I'm Ed Butler and welcome to the download of a special edition of Business Daily, in which we look at the emergence of a new economic world order. Stand aside Europe and the US, the BRICs are coming.
The change in them in total has gone from $3 trillion to $13 trillion, and that increase is effectively the equivalent of creating another US economy in 10 years. So, yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
And new nations are competing to join the club.
The real issue around BRICs is the symbolism that it reflects, and humble South Africa is privileged to be part of that process.
We have an exclusive interview with the finance ministers of both South Africa and Nigeria coming up here in the Business Daily podcast from the BBC. Now, over the past week here on Business Daily, we've been looking at the 10 years since the idea of the so-called BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India and China, came into being. Countries that were increasingly emerging from the economic shadows to become the apparent engines of global growth. The Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill first coined the term, and over those 10 years, even he's been surprised, he says, by how much they now represent the new epicentre of industrial output and change. In the next half hour, we'll be looking at how far that trend, if anything exaggerated by the global financial crisis, has yet to run. In a moment, we hear from Jim O'Neill himself, but first let's have a listen to what some of our contributors from Brazil, Russia, India and China, in that order, told us about their expectations for the future.
I am very bullish on Brazil because Brazil has been able to enlarge its economy by lifting up 40 million people. Brazil will grow in importance every day as a breadbasket to the world in a world where 1 billion people go hungry.
We have thousands of things to do, serious reforms in infrastructure, in a revolution in regulation. Our regulators are notorious for their corruption. But for the last 20 years, of course, a lot has been changed to the better.
I think we should start changing the definition of BRICS. Countries like Indonesia or South Africa need to be brought into the same group. And it is now clear that India's demography, India's progress, India's entrepreneurship will lead to even greater success than the BRICS report had predicted.
Most top decision makers in China share a consensus that change must be implemented, reforms must be implemented, and only after this can we have continued and sustainable success for the economy.
Well, Jim O'Neill has just brought out a new book called The Growth Map, looking at where continued and sustainable success can be found in the future. Looking back at the last 10 years of the BRICS, though, I asked him whether he was surprised by the growth that he'd predicted.
I guess if I reflect back on the whole decade, the single biggest surprise is just how strong collectively they all were. In the most optimistic scenario that I painted back in 2001, I argued they could get to about 14% of global GDP, and in the event it's close to 20%. So, yeah, very much surprised.
And they account for much more than that in terms of global growth, don't they?
Oh, gosh, in terms of the actual incremental growth, the change in them in total has gone from $3 trillion to $13 trillion, and that $10 trillion increase is effectively the equivalent of creating another US economy in 10 years. So, yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Can they keep it up?
I don't think they can grow at quite the same rate, and in particular, the big one within them, China, it's very difficult to see China continuing to grow at a rate of 10% a year, which is what they've done the past decade. But I think on average, the BRIC countries going forward will probably grow in the 7 to 8% vicinity, which obviously isn't as much, but in terms of their contribution to global GDP, it becomes more and more important.
You obviously coined the BRICS term. How come this label matters so much?
That's a really intriguing question. I think there are sort of three related areas. First of all, many of the Western multinationals really homed in on it and sort of saw it as part of their must-do strategy. Secondly, about 4 years ago, the political leaders in each of the BRIC countries decided to get together and meet, and that really gave it a labelling in a pretty powerful way. And then thirdly, and rather intriguingly, it's become a symbol to many other developing countries' leaders, particularly ones with large numbers of people, that kind of say, well, I want to be part of this club. So Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico, all these guys are attracted by the sort of halo status, so to speak, that comes with it.
Which brings us on rather neatly to the next acronym, doesn't it? What's the next tag going to be? Where are we looking now?
Well, I'm sort of always a little bit reluctant to get caught up in this chase for catchy acronyms, having created this one. But that being said, the four of them and four other very large emerging economies, Korea, Mexico, Indonesia and Turkey, are now so big and so important for the world, I don't think people should call them emerging economies, and I call them growth markets.
The BRICs, of course, do now welcome South Africa as part of their regular political meetings. What does that signify to you?
I was a bit surprised when the South Africa invitation to the club went out. As an economy, South Africa's a lot smaller than not only the four BRICs, but many other ambitious emerging economies. So it seemed a bit of an odd combination in that regard, but probably the reason why it happened is South Africa is the more developed nation of the whole of the continent, particularly Southern Africa, and in that sense it's sort of a gateway to the whole of the continent. It's part of the idea of the other BRIC countries reaching out to bring others as part of it and to advance, especially in terms of trade, together.
Jim O'Neill. You're listening to Business Daily from the BBC with Ed Butler. So what's it like to do business within these emerging economies? One man who does a lot is Sir Martin Sorrell, chairman of the advertising and communications group WPP. Over some 20 years, he's staked much of his company's fortune on the success of these fast-growing economies, and quite clearly, he's won. WPP is now a market leader. He says the BRICS' success has a lot to do with their sheer size.
There are 1.3 billion people in China, and there are 1.1 or 1.2 billion in India, a couple of 100 million in Brazil, 145 million in Russia. These are populations which are increasingly, through economic progress, bringing their middle classes and lower middle classes into relative prosperity, certainly out of poverty, and shifting the balance, for example, in China, from savings to consumption. So all these things have made the background for growth in these markets far greater. What we're doing is saying the prospects for growth, the shift in political, economic and social power to these countries is significant. I think, just personally, this is a long-term historical and economic trend that is very difficult for the West, A, to come to terms with, and B, to accept and do something about.
You're talking there about I suppose what some people are calling the failure of Western capitalism, and that's a term that's been touted, some quite widely, I suppose, since 2008. I mean, is there a sense in which there is something different, a different kind of vigour and enthusiasm in business terms that you're seeing in these BRICS countries that Europe and North America should be learning from?
Yeah, I think exactly right. The passion that you see in a Brazil, the passion that you see in a Russia or in India or in China or a Vietnam or Indonesia or a Colombia or a Bangladesh. I mean, the passion and exuberance and can-do attitude is extraordinary. It's exactly the same as a legacy company in any industry, a company that has become very big and very successful, becoming complacent and failing to understand that these newcomers are going to be more effective. And now you mentioned the failure of Western capitalism. The irony about China is it's state-directed capitalism. And these are free market or relatively free market mechanisms at work in Brazil, in Russia, in China and India. These systems which have embodied capitalist mechanisms have been extremely successful in driving the economies forward.